Evelyn Harrow could still remember the way sunlight looked on the morning she believed her life was stable, though that memory had begun to feel like something borrowed rather than something lived, more like a photograph she had stared at too long until the colors bled into one another. She sat on the edge of her small rental apartment sagging couch in Tacoma, Washington, her fingers wrapped around a mug that had lost its handle years ago, the ceramic chipped, her thumb rubbing the worn groove as if comfort could be extracted from broken things. The late afternoon light came in tired and uneven through the blinds she'd never been able to afford to replace, illuminating the unopened stack of envelopes on the coffee table, each stamped with increasingly firm demands, some from debt collectors with numbers so large they still punched the air out of her lungs whenever she dared open them. The latest one claimed she owed $42,700 after a predatory consolidation loan had ballooned in interest following a missed payment she hadn't realized was due, one that had come during a week when she'd barely eaten and was rationing the last $20 in her account. She hadn't told her daughter, Marissa, about this newest debt. She didn't want to see the disappointment in the young woman's eyes again, not after everything else she had already put her through. Life had not always been this way. There had been a time, not long ago, when she'd woken up every day beside her husband of 38 years, Thomas, believing loyalty was the foundation of a life well lived. But 6 months ago, she walked into their shared home, one she'd worked 2 decades to help pay for, and found him with another woman, a woman who looked barely older than Marissa, her hair long and glossy, her laughter drifting through the hallway as if it had always belonged there. The shock had been so complete that Evelyn still couldn't recall whether she screamed, cried, or simply stood there with her heart splitting open silently. What she did remember was Thomas's expression. Not guilt, not shame, but annoyance, like she had interrupted something he believed he deserved. The following weeks blurred into hopelessness. He moved out claiming she had changed, that she didn't inspire him anymore, and that he needed new energy in his life, phrases Evelyn would replay in her mind like shards of glass she couldn't stop stepping on. And if the betrayal wasn't enough, she soon discovered that he had been quietly draining their joint savings account for nearly a year, redirecting funds into a business venture he claimed would benefit them both. Instead, it turned out to be a scam, one he'd fallen for, a fake crypto investment scheme that vanished overnight, leaving her with only $212 to her name and a list of overdraft fees that seemed to multiply out of thin air. She lost her job shortly after the separation. Not because she was incompetent, but because grief had made her shaky, distracted. She worked as a receptionist at a small dental clinic, and after she'd shown up late for the 3rd time in a month, fighting tears as she tried to enter patient information, the office manager, Darla, took her aside and said, with faux sympathy, that it wasn't working out anymore. Evelyn had nodded, swallowed her humiliation, and walked out into the cold January air that stung her cheeks like punishment. Losing her health insurance followed. Her car broke down 2 months later, and the mechanic told her it would cost $1,800 to repair, money she didn't have, so it sat in the driveway of her former home, which she eventually had to leave when she couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments alone. She moved into this shabby apartment, Unit 2B of a building where faucets leaked, heaters rattled, and neighbors argued through the thin walls, because it was the only thing she could afford with her dwindling savings and the part-time housekeeping work she picked up under the table from a woman named Susan Merrill, a kind but exhausted single mother who paid Evelyn $60 per cleaning and sometimes slipped her an extra $10 when she saw how pale and tired Evelyn looked. Marissa tried to help. She was 29, working 2 jobs herself, one as a barista and the other as a receptionist at a dog grooming salon, but Evelyn couldn't bear the thought of being a burden. Their relationship had been strained since the divorce, not because Marissa blamed her but because they were both hurting in different ways, and neither knew how to say what needed to be said. Still, every Sunday, Marissa visited with a container of homemade soup or a bag of groceries, insisting it wasn't charity but daughter duty. Evelyn smiled and accepted it, though guilt knotted inside her each time. On the worst days, she stayed in bed until noon, listening to the distant hum of traffic and telling herself she would get up, she would try again. But depression made even breathing feel like lifting a heavy stone. She'd been scammed again recently, this time by a man who called pretending to be from the utility company, claiming her electricity would be shut off if she didn't pay $3.80 immediately. She gave him her debit card number, only realizing it was fraud when the real utility company sent her an automated reminder the next day saying her bill wasn't due for another week. She tried telling the bank, but they said the charge couldn't be reversed. The humiliation of it, of falling for something so obvious, made her sit on the bathroom floor for an hour, rocking slightly, feeling the old shame of childhood return, the feeling of being stupid, being slow, being the last one to understand things in school. Still, life had not completely abandoned her. In her apartment building, she befriended an elderly widower named George Ramirez, who lived in Unit 3C and always carried a tin of peppermints in his jacket pocket. He saw her struggling with a broken grocery bag one day and helped her carry everything upstairs, insisting it was no trouble. Over time, he became someone she could talk to, someone who understood loneliness intimately. He'd lost his wife of 45 years to cancer and told Evelyn that grief came in waves, sometimes soft, sometimes cruel, but always moving. His presence was a quiet comfort, the kind she hadn't realized she needed. Another unexpected supporter was Lily Tran, a young woman in her 20s who lived down the hall and worked nights as a nursing assistant. She often checked in on Evelyn, bringing leftover hospital cafeteria meals or offering to walk with her to the bus stop on evenings when the street felt unsafe. These people, small lights in the heavy fog of her life, kept her from disappearing completely into despair. Yet tonight, as Evelyn sat staring at the stack of bills, the weight of everything felt unbearable. She felt like a woman who had lived several lifetimes' worth of pain in a single year, a woman unraveling thread by thread. The phone buzzed beside her, another unknown number. Fear shot through her like electricity. She let it ring until it stopped. The quiet that followed was thick, suffocating. She closed her eyes, took a trembling breath, and whispered to no one, "I don't know how much more I can take," her voice cracking like thin ice beneath too much weight. But somewhere deep within her, beneath the exhaustion and the fear, there was a small ember, nearly extinguished, but still present. She didn't know yet that the coming months would test her further than she thought possible, but they would also show her that broken things could still be mended, that even shattered lives could find light again in ways they never expected. The following morning, Evelyn woke before dawn, her body aching the way it always did after a night of restless thoughts and shallow sleep, the type where dreams felt more like reminders of everything she'd lost rather than escapes from reality. The room was cold, her heater clicked in protest more than it actually warmed the space, but she didn't turn on the light, choosing instead to sit in the dim blue haze seeping through the blinds, letting the world stay quiet a little longer. She checked her phone mechanically, seeing 3 missed calls from the same unknown number and 1 voicemail she was too afraid to open. Her bank app showed $46.19 remaining. Rent was due in 5 days. The thought made her stomach tighten to the point of nausea. She considered calling her landlord, Mr. Brenner, a thin, expressionless man who owned 3 buildings and cared about tenants only insofar as they paid him on time, but she knew his response already, if it's late, there's a fee. If it's more than 3 days late, I start the eviction process. He had said those exact words to the single mother in Unit 1A just 2 months earlier, and that woman had vanished overnight, leaving behind a baby stroller by the dumpster as if she had to flee faster than she could think. Evelyn tried to shake the image from her mind, but it sat heavy on her chest. She put on her thinning sweater, one Marissa had bought for her years ago, and walked to the kitchen, where she made a cup of instant coffee, stirring it slowly, savoring the only small ritual that felt predictable. The bitterness grounded her. She needed that. She had worked today, cleaning Susan Merrill's house on the west side of town, and although the pay barely dented her mounting debts, it was something she could cling to. Something that made her feel useful. The bus was late again, the wind sharp as it cut through the thin material of her coat, and she kept her hands tucked beneath her armpits for warmth. A teenager waiting nearby blasted music through his broken phone speaker, its distorted bass rattling the air, but Evelyn didn't mind. It was noise, something to fill the silence that often felt too loud. When she finally boarded, she chose a seat near the front, gripping the metal rail as the bus lurched forward. Tacoma blurred by, gray streets, boarded-up storefronts, early workers shuffling with tired faces. She wondered how many of them carried invisible burdens the way she did, how many were close to breaking but forced to move anyway. At the next stop, Lily boarded, her scrubs wrinkled from a long night shift, her eyes drooping with exhaustion. She spotted Evelyn immediately and sat beside her with a small smile. "You look like you could use breakfast," she said, handing over a packaged muffin from her bag. Evelyn tried to decline, but Lily nudged it toward her anyway. "Take it. Please. The hospital gives out way too many." Something inside Evelyn softened. She accepted the muffin, whispering a thank you, feeling tears prick unexpectedly at the corner of her eyes. Kindness always seemed to hit her harder than cruelty, maybe because she expected the cruelty now. Cleaning Susan's house took nearly 5 hours. It was a modest 2-bedroom with warm-colored walls and picture frames filled with smiling children. Evelyn wiped down counters, scrubbed dried food from the stove, changed bedding, and folded laundry, her back tightening with each movement. She moved slowly today, her chest feeling heavy, her breath occasionally catching. Susan noticed. "Are you okay, Evelyn?" she asked softly while sorting mail at the kitchen table. Susan was younger, maybe 43, with tired, kind eyes and a perpetual aura of someone who had too much to handle but faced it anyway. Evelyn nodded, embarrassed by the idea of being pitted. But Susan didn't push. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I know this wasn't part of the agreement," she said, handing it over, "but I had a good week at work, and I want you to have this." Inside was $100, an amount that felt almost unreal, like something that belonged in a dream. Evelyn's hands trembled. "I can't," she whispered. "You have your own kids, your own bills." But Susan shook her head firmly. "You help me more than you know," she said. "Take it. Please." The sincerity of her voice cracked something open inside Evelyn. She nodded, unable to speak. When she stepped outside into the crisp air afterward, she clutched the envelope to her chest, letting the warmth of that gesture sink in like a rare moment of sunlight. The afternoon brought a different kind of storm. When she returned home, the voicemail notification still blinked accusingly on her phone. She finally pressed play. The voice was cold, monotone, rehearsed. "This is a final notice regarding your outstanding balance of $8,904 with Northwest Recovery Services. Failure to respond will result in escalation, including potential legal action or wage garnishment." The threat hit her like a physical blow. Wage garnishment. From what? Her under-the-table housekeeping earnings. Her non-existent savings. She felt her knees weaken and lowered herself to the couch, her breath quickening, her throat closing. Tears came, slow at first, then uncontrollable, the kind that left her chest heaving. She pressed the heels of her palms to her eyes, wishing she could disappear, wishing she could go back in time to before everything unraveled. She didn't know Thomas had taken out credit cards in her name, 3 of them, until after the divorce papers were signed. By the time she learned, the balances were already past due, interest compounding like a living, growing beast. She had tried explaining to the debt collectors that she hadn't known, that she hadn't spent a dime, but they didn't care. Legally, the accounts were tied to her, the responsibility was hers. Every day, she paid for a betrayal she didn't commit. When Marissa visited that evening, carrying a container of chicken noodle soup and a small bag of groceries, she immediately noticed Evelyn's red, swollen eyes. "Mom, what happened?" she asked, setting the items down and kneeling in front of her. Evelyn hesitated, her instinct to protect her daughter battling with the weight of everything threatening to crush her. But the words slipped out anyway, halting, shaky, fragmented. She told her about the voicemail, about the loan she couldn't pay, about the scam she fell for, about the rent she wouldn't be able to cover. For a moment, Marissa didn't speak. Then she wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tightly, her own tears falling. "We're going to figure this out," she whispered fiercely. "You're not alone. Not anymore." Evelyn clung to her like a lifeline, feeling both relief and shame coexist painfully in her chest. She hated needing help, hated how small her world had become. But something shifted that night, something subtle but real. Marissa stayed for hours, helping her make a list of debts, organizing each one into categories, suggesting they reach out to a nonprofit credit counseling agency she'd heard about. She even offered to move in with Evelyn temporarily to help cover expenses, but Evelyn refused. The apartment was too small, and she didn't want her daughter to give up her independence. Still, the offer meant more than words could express. Later, after Marissa left, Evelyn went upstairs to the laundry room to wash her sheets. She didn't expect anyone to be there, but she found George sitting on one of the plastic chairs, reading a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea. He looked up and smiled gently. "Long day?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, her throat tightening. "The kind that makes you wonder what the point is anymore," she admitted quietly. George closed the book, leaning forward with elbows on his knees. "The point," he said, "is that you're still here. Still trying. Most people don't realize how much courage that takes." His voice was steady, warm, grounding. She sat beside him, and for the first time in maybe weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. They talked for nearly an hour, about loss, about fear, about resilience they didn't ask for but somehow possessed. When she finally returned to her apartment, she felt, not good, not healed, but steadier. And that was something. That night, however, sleep wouldn't come. She lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying old memories she wished she could erase. The moment she found Thomas with the other woman, the moment the bank told her the money was gone, the moment she lost her job, the moment she realized she had no control left. She wondered what Thomas was doing now. If he was happy. If he ever thought about her. She doubted it. She remembered when he used to bring her coffee in bed on Sundays, when he promised her that they'd grow old together, when they spoke about retirement plans and traveling once Marissa was settled. Now, he lived across town with a woman Evelyn referred to privately as the ghost, because thinking of her in any other way hurt too much. Evelyn turned on her side, curled into herself, and whispered a prayer to no one in particular. "Please, just let something change. I can't keep falling." But the room stayed quiet, and the darkness answered only with its silence. 2 days later, the world seemed determined to bury Evelyn beneath more weight than she could carry. It started with a letter slipped under her door, no envelope, just a thin sheet of paper with bold red text at the top, notice of possible eviction. Her breath hitched as she read the words, her eyes darting frantically across the page. She had 3 days to pay the remaining balance of her rent, $862, or Mr. Brenner would initiate formal removal procedures. Her hands shook violently, the edges of the paper cutting lightly against her fingers. A sound escaped her, small and broken, something between a gasp and a whimper. She sank onto the floor, back against the door, clutching the notice like it might dissolve if she held it tightly enough. The apartment seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in with the weight of every failure, every consequence she couldn't outrun. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She felt the beginning of a panic attack, sharp, familiar, terrifying. Her chest tightened, breath coming in short, jagged pulls as if her lungs were refusing to expand. She hadn't had one this severe in at least 5 years, not since her mother's funeral. She pressed her palms to the floor, trying to anchor herself, whispering small, desperate reminders, "You're here. You're okay. You're alive, but the fear was a tidal wave." When the attack finally passed, leaving her trembling and drained, she curled on the floor for a long moment before forcing herself up. She needed to think. She needed something. She didn't know what. She grabbed her purse and walked outside, unsure of where she was going until she found herself at the bus stop again. She boarded without a destination, letting the city carry her where it wanted. Her reflection in the bus window startled her, pale skin, sunken eyes, guilt etched so deeply into her features she barely recognized herself. She rode for nearly an hour before getting off in downtown Tacoma, near the waterfront, where cold wind swept up from the Puget Sound and slapped her cheeks with stinging force. She walked aimlessly, passing shuttered shops and small cafes she used to visit with Thomas on lazy weekends. Every memory felt like an intrusion, an unwanted ghost clutching the edges of her heart. She stopped at a bench overlooking the water, where gulls circled overhead, crying harshly into the morning. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in the pieces threatening to spill out. She didn't realize she was crying again until a soft voice interrupted. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Evelyn turned to see a young man, maybe 25, wearing a navy jacket embroidered with pier maintenance staff. His expression wasn't pitying but genuinely concerned. She wiped her cheeks quickly. "Yes. I'm fine. Just thinking." He hesitated before nodding slowly. "Well, if you need a moment, you can sit here as long as you like. But it's really cold. I can get you a cup of hot chocolate from the stand if you want. It's on me." His kindness stunned her. She opened her mouth to decline but stopped. Something about his sincerity melted the defensive wall she typically kept up. "Thank you," she whispered. He returned moments later with a steaming paper cup. She held it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her stiff fingers. "My grandmother sits here sometimes," he said as he walked away. "She says the water listens better than people do." Evelyn smiled faintly, small, fragile, but real. She watched the ripples across the surface of the water and let herself breathe for just a minute. Eventually, reality returned. She needed money, fast. She decided to visit a local community center she had heard about from Marissa, a place called Horizon Outreach Services. The building was unassuming, gray brick, faded sign, but inside it buzzed with quiet activity. Volunteers sorting donations, people filling out forms, others waiting with the exhausted patience of those who have been in survival mode too long. Evelyn approached the front desk where a woman in her 50s with warm brown eyes smiled gently. Her name tag read Angela McKnight. "How can I help you today?" Angela asked. Evelyn hesitated, shame rising like heat beneath her skin. I'm behind on rent," she managed. "I might be evicted." Angela nodded, not with surprise but familiarity, as though she carried the stories of hundreds of people just like Evelyn. "Okay. Let's take this one step at a time," she said. She guided Evelyn to a small office with a door that didn't quite close all the way. There, they talked for nearly an hour, about Evelyn's debts, her job loss, her husband's betrayal, the scams she'd fallen for, the panic attacks, the isolation. Angela listened. Truly listened. And for the first time in months, Evelyn didn't feel judged. When she finished, Angela reached across the desk and squeezed her hand. "You are not alone," she said firmly. "And you are not beyond help. We can cover half of your rent this month. It's not everything, but it's a start." Evelyn's breath caught. Half. That was $4.31, money she had no idea how she would ever repay in kindness. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, thank you so much." Angela also signed her up for a food assistance program and gave her information on financial counseling services that could help negotiate with her creditors. When Evelyn left the center, she felt as though she had been handed a lifeline she hadn't dared hope for. But life rarely let her rest. That evening, as she heated leftover soup, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she opened it. Asterisk, this is your final opportunity to resolve your unpaid loan balance. Failure to respond immediately will result in a warrant for your arrest. Asterisk, her heart lurched. Arrest? She stared at the screen until her vision blurred, panic clawing at her throat. She called the number back, desperate, and a man answered within seconds. His voice was stern, aggressive, rehearsed. He claimed she owed $2,600, that the police would be at her door within hours if she didn't pay, that her case file had already been submitted. Evelyn's mind spun. She begged him to give her time. He told her she had 40 minutes to go by prepaid gift cards and read him the numbers. Something about his exactness, his coldness, his insistence, it snapped something in her. She suddenly remembered Marissa telling her about scams like this, how criminals preyed on fear. Her breathing slowed. I'm not paying, she said, voice trembling but firm. I know this is fake. The line went dead. Evelyn sat in stunned silence for a long time, her heart still pounding but her mind strangely clear. For the first time in a long while, she had stood up for herself. Later that night, she knocked softly on George's door. She didn't even know why. Maybe she couldn't stand being alone with her thoughts, maybe she needed a voice that wasn't threatening or demanding. He opened the door with an apron on and the smell of sautéed onions drifting into the hallway. Are you hungry? He asked before she could speak. She hadn't eaten since morning. He ushered her inside, where a pot of arroz con pollo simmered on the stove. The warmth of his apartment, cozy, cluttered with photos and plants, wrapped around her like a blanket. They ate together at his small round table. Between bites, she told him everything, the eviction notice, the community center, the scammer who tried to frighten her. George listened with the gentle steadiness she had come to depend on. When she finished, he reached across the table and rested his hand on hers. You are stronger than you think, he said quietly. Most people break long before this point. But you're still fighting. The words hit her like a bomb, soothing but also overwhelming. She blinked away tears. I don't feel strong, she whispered. I feel like I'm barely surviving. George shook his head. Surviving is strength. Don't ever forget that. That night, back in her apartment, Evelyn lay in bed listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. For once, the silence didn't suffocate her. She thought about the young worker on the pier, about Angela's steady compassion, about George's warm kitchen, about Marissa's fierce love. And amid the exhaustion and fear, a thought surfaced, small, fragile, but undeniable. Maybe I'm not as alone as I thought. She closed her eyes, letting that truth settle beside her like a quiet companion. Outside, rain began tapping against the window, soft and steady, like the world whispering that even after the worst storms, something gentle could still arrive. The next morning brought a kind of stillness that felt deceptive, like the world had momentarily paused only to gather strength before dropping another weight onto her shoulders. Evelyn woke with a throbbing headache, her pillow damp from the tears she hadn't realized she shed in the night. As she sat up, she felt her joints crack in protest, her body reminding her of the years it had lived through and the ones it had barely endured. She moved slowly, pulling on the same pair of jeans she had worn yesterday, running a brush through her hair until it fell into its familiar uneven waves. She looked in the bathroom mirror and saw the grief carved into her face like permanent etchings, the deep lines around her mouth, the dark hollows beneath her eyes, the downward pull of her expression even when she tried to smile. At 60, she felt decades older. She made coffee though she wasn't hungry and tried to distract herself by tidying the apartment, but every movement felt heavy, every corner reminded her of the impending eviction if she couldn't come up with the remaining balance. She kept replaying numbers in her head, asterisk asterisk 862. 431. 431, asterisk asterisk, as if chanting them might conjure the money she needed. Around noon, she decided to gather every coin and crumpled bill in her purse, in drawers, under couch cushions, inside old jackets. She found $12.76 in total. It felt like a cruel joke. She stared at the sad little pile on her kitchen table and felt her chest tighten again, tears blurring the edges of the world. But she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't collapse every time life pushed her. Not today. She received a text from Susan around 1 p.m. *, I'll need an extra cleaning this week. Are you available tomorrow? I can pay $80 this time. Relief flooded through Evelyn so quickly it made her hands shake. She typed back immediately, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. It wasn't enough to cover the rent, but it was something, and something mattered. She tried to hold on to that thought as she slipped on her shoes and headed for the bus. She decided to go back to Horizon Outreach Services to ask if there were any other programs she qualified for, even if it meant revealing more vulnerability than she felt comfortable showing. She hated asking for help. She'd been raised in a family that believed suffering was a private affair, emotions were inconveniences, and relying on anyone else was a sign of weakness. But she couldn't afford pride now, not when the consequences were so dire. At Horizon, Angela greeted her with the same warm expression as the day before. Evelyn, she said gently, how are you holding up? The question cracked her composure instantly. She sank into the chair across from Angela's desk and confessed she still didn't have the rest of the rent money. Angela listened without interruption, nodding slowly. There's a program we sometimes refer clients to, she said, flipping through a worn binder. It's run by a local church, even if you're not religious. They offer emergency one-time rental assistance. It's not guaranteed, but you could try. She scribbled the address on a sticky note and handed it to Evelyn. And if that doesn't work, come back. We'll figure something else out. Evelyn nodded, clutching the small slip of paper like it was something precious. She left the center with a mixture of fear and hope battling in her chest, two emotions she had become far too familiar with lately. The church wasn't far, but the walk felt long. Her legs ached, and the December cold cut through her thin coat like knife edges. When she arrived, she hesitated before pushing the heavy wooden door open. The interior was warm, lit by soft yellow bulbs strung along the ceiling. A woman in a beige sweater stood behind a folding table near the altar, sorting paperwork. Her name tag read Pastor Elaine. She looked up as Evelyn approached. How can I help you, dear? She asked in a voice so gentle it nearly undid Evelyn. She explained her situation, haltingly at first, then with growing desperation, describing the eviction notice, the debt, the hopelessness that had followed her like a shadow. Pastor Elaine listened with sympathetic eyes, then reached across the table to rest a hand on Evelyn's forearm. You've been carrying so much, she murmured. No one should have to bear all that alone. She stepped away for a moment, rifling through a locked cabinet before returning with a form. We can help with up to $300, she said. The number made Evelyn's breath hitch. It wasn't the full amount, but it brought the remaining balance down to $131, a sum that suddenly felt almost manageable. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered gratitude over and over, her voice cracking. Pastor Elaine squeezed her hand gently. You are worth helping, she said softly. Don't forget that. By late afternoon, Evelyn felt lighter, still anxious, still uncertain, but lighter. She walked home with a faint sense of accomplishment, something she hadn't felt in a long time. When she reached her building, she found George sitting on the front steps, his jacket zipped all the way up, a small bag of groceries beside him. You weren't answering your phone, he said as she approached. I brought you a few things. He held up the bag, rice, eggs, canned soup, a loaf of bread. Evelyn's throat tightened. George, you didn't have to. He smiled gently. I know. That's why I wanted to. The simplicity of his kindness almost made her weep again, but she held it together. They sat on the steps for a few minutes, talking about nothing in particular. The air was crisp, the sky fading into soft lavender shades as the sun dipped behind the trees. For a small moment, she felt at peace. But peace, she'd learned, was fragile. When she opened her mailbox later, she found a letter from the medical billing department at St. Joseph Medical Center. At first, she wasn't alarmed. She rarely visited the hospital, only once last year when she'd fallen on the ice and twisted her ankle. But as she unfolded the letter, dread crept down her spine. The bill was $4.1260, a charge she didn't recognize. As she read further, her stomach dropped. The date of service was from 2 months earlier, an ER visit she never made. Someone had used her identity. Someone had used her information. Her knees buckled, and she leaned against the hallway wall, breath shaking. Another burden. Another wave. Another cut to skin already barely held together. She returned to her apartment in a daze, pacing as panic surged. Identity theft. Fraud. More debt. More damage. She felt the world tilting, the floor beneath her threatening to give way. She called Marissa. Her daughter arrived within 20 minutes, breathless, worry etched into her features. When Evelyn handed her the bill, Marissa's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "No," she said fiercely. "Absolutely not. We're fighting this." She spent the next hour making calls, hospital billing. The insurance provider Evelyn no longer had, a fraud hotline. Evelyn watched her daughter, this woman she had raised, this woman she worried she had failed, take control with a strength that inspired awe. "We'll dispute it," Marissa said after hanging up. "It may take time, but we'll fix this. I promise." Evelyn felt tears gathering again, but this time they were rooted in something softer, gratitude mixed with grief, pride mixed with sorrow. After Marissa left, Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, emotionally drained. She thought about Thomas, about how he had promised her safety, stability, partnership, only to leave destruction in his wake. She wondered if he ever lost sleep over what he'd done. She doubted it. But then she thought of Marissa, of George, of Angela and Pastor Elaine, of Susan, of the young man on the pier. All these people who had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. Maybe the world was not made solely of betrayal. Maybe there were still pockets of gentleness, of humanity, of grace. She laid back, staring at the cracked ceiling once more. Her body was tired, her spirit frayed, but something inside her, small, fragile, but alive, began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, she would make it through this. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe it. The next week unfolded with a kind of fragile urgency, each day heavy with the knowledge that time was running out, that even with the church's help and Susan's payment, Evelyn still needed $131 before the eviction deadline. It wasn't a large sum in the grand scheme of life, but to her, in this moment, it felt like a mountain carved from iron. She woke early each morning, forcing herself to move even when her body begged her to stay in bed. She cleaned Susan's house again, scrubbing walls until her knuckles ached, vacuuming every corner, rearranging toys and folded laundry with meticulous care. Susan paid her the promised $80, pressing the bills gently into her hand. "You're doing okay?" she asked softly. Evelyn nodded, even though the truth hovered somewhere between yes and no. She was surviving, but surviving often felt like drowning slowly, a battle where you never felt the ground beneath your feet. After she left Susan's house, she stopped by a thrift shop and sold an old silver bracelet her mother had given her decades ago, one of the last sentimental pieces she'd kept after the divorce forced her to pawn nearly everything. The owner gave her $25 for it. She accepted the money with a quiet nod, stuffing it into her coat pocket before her tears spilled. By that evening, she had $105 of the $131, but the remaining $26 felt as unreachable as thousands had once felt. That night, as she walked home from the bus stop, the December wind whipping against her cheeks, she felt the sting of loneliness settle deeper into her bones. Couples passed her on the sidewalk, bundled close, laughing softly. A mother guided her toddler with mitten-wrapped hands. A group of teenagers ran ahead of her, shouting and teasing each other, their faces flushed with cold and youth. The world felt full of connections she no longer had, full of warmth she couldn't touch. When she reached her building, she paused before going inside, staring up at the dimly lit windows, wondering how she had gone from homeowner to near homeless in less than a year. It felt surreal, as though she had been picked up and thrown into a life that didn't belong to her. She remembered the nights when she and Thomas would sit by their fireplace, drinking tea and talking about retirement plans, Arizona, maybe, or a little cabin near the mountains. They used to dream together. Now he was living with a woman half her age, while she was selling jewelry for grocery money. She wondered if he ever thought about her at all. The answer hurt either way. Inside, she found a small note taped to her door in George's shaky handwriting, *, knock if you need company. I made pozole. *, a soft smile pulled at the corner of her mouth despite the weight she carried. She didn't knock, she couldn't bear the idea of interrupting him again, but she pressed the note to her chest for a moment, letting the warmth of being cared for linger before she unlocked her door. The apartment felt colder than usual. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat on the couch, staring at the eviction notice on the coffee table. 3 days left. She tried to think of what else she could sell: clothes, old books, a barely functioning microwave. But even if she sold everything she owned, she doubted she'd have more than a few dollars to show for it. She ran a trembling hand through her hair and forced herself to breathe. There had to be a way. The next morning, an unexpected knock startled her. She opened the door to find Marissa standing there, cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a reusable grocery bag. I brought a few things, she said, stepping inside. She unpacked fruit, pasta, tea, a small rotisserie chicken. Evelyn felt guilt rise up again, thick, suffocating. Honey, you're working 2 jobs, she said softly. You shouldn't be spending money on me. Marissa shrugged, brushing her hair behind her ear. Mom, I want to. And besides, she hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've been thinking about something. She handed the paper to Evelyn, who unfolded it slowly. It was an apartment listing, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, modest price. Marissa looked at her with hopeful eyes. Maybe we could live together for a while. Just until things settle. It would save us both money. Evelyn felt the air thicken. The thought was tempting, comforting, even, but the idea of dragging Marissa into her chaos filled her with dread. I can't do that to you, she whispered. You deserve your own life. Marissa shook her head. I deserve my mother to be okay. The words hit Evelyn like a blow, soft but devastating. She pulled her daughter into a tight hug, burying her face in her shoulder. I'm trying, she whispered. I'm really trying. Marissa held her tighter. I know. And you don't have to do it alone. Later that afternoon, after Marissa left for work, Evelyn forced herself to make calls, something she hated, something that always spiked her anxiety. She dialed utility companies, credit collectors, the medical billing office, anyone who might offer extensions or leniency. Most responses were cold, scripted, indifferent. * we understand your situation, but payment is required. **, we can offer a reduced settlement of $5,400 if paid within 30 days. **, we do not accept payment arrangements at this time. Each rejection chipped at her hope. She paced the living room, clutching her phone, feeling like a fragile structure cracking under pressure. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the device. She sat down on the carpet, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking slightly as she tried to steady her breath. "Please," she whispered into the quiet. "Just, please. I'm trying." But the apartment offered no answer. Near dusk, a soft knock sounded. She expected Marissa or maybe George, but instead, she opened the door to find Lily, her young neighbor, bundled in a thick coat, cheeks pink from the cold. "I haven't seen you all day," Lily said, worry creasing her brow. "You okay?" Evelyn opened her mouth to lie, but something inside her gave up pretending. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes instantly. Lily stepped forward, pulling her into a hug without hesitation. It felt strange, being held by someone so much younger, so full of life, but also strangely comforting. Inside, they sat on the couch, and Evelyn explained the eviction situation, her voice cracking under the strain. When she finished, Lily reached for her hand. "How much do you need?" she asked. Evelyn shook her head quickly. No, honey, I can't borrow money from you." But Lily wasn't listening. She reached into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and placed $30 on the table. "Take it," she said. "Please. I remember what it felt like when my mom and I almost got evicted. We survived because someone helped us. Now I get to do the same." Evelyn covered her mouth with her hands, overwhelmed. That $30, that simple act, meant survival. Meant safety. Meant she might actually make it through this. She hugged Lily tightly, sobbing into her shoulder. Lily held her with the maturity of someone who'd known hardship too young. That night, after Lily left, Evelyn sat in silence, staring at the small stack of money she had gathered, $131 exactly. She counted it 3 times just to be certain. Relief washed over her so suddenly she had to sit down. She pressed the bills to her chest and let out a shaky, broken laugh that turned into tears, tears of exhaustion, of disbelief, of gratitude. She would pay the rent tomorrow. She would keep her home. She wasn't safe, not truly, not with the debts, the identity theft, the lingering trauma, but she had survived another day. Another battle. Another impossible moment. And in the quiet, she let herself whisper something she had not dared in months, maybe things can still get better. The next morning, Evelyn woke before sunrise, heart pounding with a strange mixture of relief and dread. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of her apartment, the radiator clicking irregularly, the faint drip of the bathroom faucet, the muffled footsteps of early risers moving through the halls. It was the sound of ordinary life, of a normal morning, and yet it felt like something sacred after the chaos of the past week. She dressed slowly, pulling on her warmest sweater, smoothing it over her trembling hands, and slipped the neatly counted $131 into her purse. On her way out, she paused briefly in the doorway, glancing back into the small apartment she'd nearly lost. It wasn't much, not the home she once had, not the life she'd imagined reaching its 60, but it was hers. Hers to protect. Hers to rebuild from. The cold morning air bit sharply at her cheeks as she walked to the leasing office. Her breath formed small white clouds before dissolving into the gray sky. When she stepped inside, the warmth hit her like a blanket. Mr. Brenner sat behind the desk, peering over reading glasses, his expression neutral, bordering on indifferent. He barely looked up as she approached. When she handed him the money order, her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped it. He inspected it briefly, then nodded once. "Your balance is clear," he said flatly. "Next month's rent is due on the 1st. No kindness, no acknowledgement that she had fought tooth and nail for this moment. But Evelyn didn't need his approval, she only needed his signature acknowledging receipt, which he slid across the counter without ceremony. She walked out with her shoulders trembling, her knees weak, but her heart finally, untightening. When she stepped outside, she felt the weight of the past week's shift, not vanish, but rearrange itself into something less suffocating. She stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the cold wind wash over her face like a baptism. For the first time in months, she felt grounded. Not healed. Not fixed. But grounded. She walked back to her apartment with a steadier step than she'd had in ages. When she reached her door, she found a small paper bag resting against it. Inside was a container of pozole, still warm, and a note from George that read, "for your good day. There will be more." Tears filled her eyes instantly, soft, grateful tears that didn't burn the way they used to. She knocked on his door gently. When he opened it, she didn't speak, she simply hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder. George, kind and steady as always, patted her back. "You're stronger than you know, Evelyn," he said softly. "And every storm ends. Even the worst ones." The days that followed unfolded with a new rhythm, still fragile, still difficult, but stitched with threads of hope so subtle she almost missed them. She met with the nonprofit credit counselor Angela referred her to. The counselor, a patient, soft-spoken man named David Kingsley, helped her call several debt collectors, negotiating reduced interest rates, halting compounding fees, and arranging long-term payment plans she could manage. For the first time, the ledger of her life, those terrifying numbers she avoided for months, felt less like a noose and more like something she could slowly untangle. The fraudulent medical bill was flagged officially as identity theft, and though it would take time, she was assured she wouldn't be responsible for the charges. Evelyn felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her sit down on the couch, pressing her hand to her heart as if to steady it. Meanwhile, Lily visited often, sometimes just to check in, sometimes bringing leftovers from late shifts, sometimes to sit and talk about her dreams of becoming a registered nurse. Evelyn realized that Lily, despite her youth, had grown into one of her closest friends, someone who gave without hesitation and loved without fear. Even Susan texted her one evening, offering more consistent work hours after seeing how exhausted Evelyn looked. "You're dependable," she said. "And you put your whole heart into helping people." "I see that." Those words clung to Evelyn like a warm scarf. Slowly, she began reclaiming parts of herself she thought she'd lost forever. She started taking short afternoon walks, sometimes down to the pier, sometimes just around the block. On one of those walks, she saw the young maintenance worker again, the one who had brought her hot chocolate, and she smiled, genuinely this time. "Better day today?" he asked kindly. She nodded. "Better than most." She also spent more time with Marissa, cooking dinner together on Sundays, laughing about old memories, rediscovering a closeness that grief had once fractured. One evening, Marissa shared that she'd been promoted to assistant manager at one of her jobs. Evelyn hugged her tightly, pride swelling in her chest like something bright and warm. Watching her daughter reclaim her own life made Evelyn believe she might do the same. Yet healing wasn't linear. There were nights when she still woke shaking, haunted by the image of Thomas with the other woman, by the sound of the debt collector's threats, by the memory of her bank balance dwindling into nothing. Some mornings, she still felt too heavy to move. But on those days, she remembered George's words, "every storm ends," and she remembered the hands that had lifted her, the voices that insisted she was worth helping, the small acts of kindness that had stitched her spirit back into something resembling wholeness. She began journaling again, a habit she hadn't touched since her 20s, scribbling her anxieties, her progress, her gratitude. One entry ended with a sentence that surprised her when she read it back, "I am still here, and maybe that is enough." Winter slowly softened into early spring. The snow melted, the sidewalks cleared, the air shed its sharpness. Evelyn found a part-time job at a small local bookstore, dusty, quiet, filled with the comfort of paper and stories. The owner, a woman in her 70s named Helen, hired her after a 10-minute conversation. "You have a gentle presence," Helen said. People need that more than they admit. The pay wasn't great, but the stability, however modest, felt like a miracle. In the quiet hours between shelving books and ringing up customers, Evelyn found a peace she hadn't felt in years. Books reminded her that every life had chapters, and some chapters were meant to break you open just so the next ones could rebuild you differently. One afternoon, as she closed up the shop at dusk, she stood outside and watched the sun slip behind the skyline, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and breathed deeply. She thought of the woman she had been a year ago, broken, blindsided, drowning beneath betrayal and debt. And then she thought of the woman she had become, still fragile in places, still learning, but standing. Surrounded by people who loved her. Slowly rebuilding a life that felt like hers again. When she walked home that evening, she paused at her building's entrance and looked up at the window of her apartment, her home. Warm light spilled through the curtains. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Inside, she heated a bowl of leftover pozole from George and sat at her small kitchen table, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant laughter of neighbors through the walls. She felt a kind of quiet settle into her bones, peaceful, warm, steady. Not the peace that comes from a perfect life, but the peace that comes after surviving what should have destroyed you. The kind earned through endurance, through love, through tiny miracles that arrive when you least expect them. She closed her eyes and whispered a soft thank you, to the universe, to the people who saved her, to the parts of herself that refused to give up even when everything felt impossible. And as she ate, wrapped in the quiet glow of her kitchen, Evelyn Harrow realized she was no longer living in the ruins of her past. She was living in the beginning of something new. Something hopeful. Something hers. The storm had passed. The ground beneath her feet had steadied. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt at peace. For more gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.